So my name is Kamran Mateen. I'm a director of Center for International Theory at Sussex. Our center was, Center for Advanced International Theory. So the center was established in 2011 at the Department of International Relations here at University of Sussex. The defining mission of the center is to support and disseminate innovative fundamental research in international theory, free of the requirement of direct policy. I'm also trying to let people in as they join. So the center has a number of recurrent activities, including Sussex International Theory Lectures, which happens once a year. Then we have Sussex International Theory Prize. We give a prize to the outstanding innovative theoretical research in international relations every year. We have every year an annual International Theory Symposium, and we also have visiting fellowship, so people can come and join us for a period of time here at Sussex. We have a website. If you are interested in joining our mailing list, you can get in touch with us through the links in the website for the center. So I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Patrick Quinton-Brown, who is going to talk about his new book, Intervention Before Interventionism, a Global Genealogy. Patrick is an assistant professor of international relations at Singapore Management University. He was previously at the a lecturer at the Department of International Relations at University of Oxford. And he also did his PhD at University of Oxford. You've completed in 2022. So Patrick's current research focuses on the intergovernmental practices of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, particularly in relation to sovereignty and non-intervention. This research builds on existing studies of South-North encounters and their normative and political consequences. It is concerned primarily with non-Western contestations of Western-dominated order. More broadly, Patrick is interested in theories of international relations and global governance, international organizations and institutions, interpretive and post-colonial approaches, and the global South in historical international society, especially the non-aligned movement and the G77 plus China. So Patrick has published widely in journals including International Affairs, Review of International Studies, International Relations, and Millennium Journal of International Studies. And today, Patrick will tell us about his new book, as I mentioned earlier, Intervention Before Interventionism. So without further ado, Patrick, the floor is yours. You have roughly 35, 40 minutes, and then we let audience to pose comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cameron, for the introduction, the invitation, and thank you to CAIT, the Center for Advanced International Theory, and of course, thank you all for coming. Very much looking forward to your questions and your comments. So what I wanted to do with my 35 to 40 minutes is to give you a sense of the main arguments of this book, where it came from, what it's trying to do. And along those lines, I have in mind a talk divided into 5 parts. So in the first part, I'll introduce the concepts of intervention and non-intervention in international society theory. Here I want to propose a problematization of prevailing narratives of the constitution of global order. I'm going to say that a new interpretation, one told from within non-aligned and global Southern revolt, would provide a much better explanation of the function of the intervention concept than the sorts of narratives we usually know, and not least in an age of hegemonic transition. What I'm going to say in the second part is that what we need is a much more critical and genealogical approach to the intervention problem. So I'll, in that second part, recount an instructive story, which I use as a kind of foil in the first chapter of the book to explain anti-naturalist and interpretivist methodological commitments. I want to suggest that so-called traditionalist literature on intervention, but also much post-traditionalist literature, has committed tacitly an egregious naturalist error in terms of concept formation, which the book tries to address. And then third, I'll demonstrate how I use genealogy to uncover a more truthful and global account of international society and international societal change. I'm arguing that the anti-colonial redescription of intervention was a historic normative achievement of the non-aligned and developing world, yet it remains very deeply misunderstood, even misrepresented. So I'll briefly introduce what I call the anti-colonial or Bandung theory of intervention. Now, this Bandung theory, of course, had its critics, its excesses. There were attempts at its reappropriation for both moderate and radical purposes. It also came to be applied in new dimensions over time. You know, there's a discursive shift that occurs in relation to the international economic and the international communicative, for example. And at times, this was a theory abused, taken out of context, which really provided its opponents with a pretense of ignorance. So I'll say a few words on all of that. And then finally, only after having done all of this, can we advance a novel critique of the liberal interventionist moment. We should understand the conceit of our late interventionism, not merely as a matter of hubris, but rather something much more mendacious, particularly in relation to Bandung. And then I understand we'll have some time for Q&A, which I'm really looking forward to. So this book, Intervention Before Interventionism, is concerned with the meanings of intervention in the beliefs and practices of statespeople. It's an attempt at mapping out the normative and institutionalized trajectories of those meanings over time. And it proposes a comprehensive revision of the work we think has been performed by this vocabulary since the end of the Second World War. And that's a revision rooted in the Global South project of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And what prompted it many years ago was basically an attempt to escape from the shadow, I'd say, of a particular interventionism. A shadow under which so many scholars and students of IR, especially of my generation, came to understand a global sovereignty intervention debate. Its very first title, then as a doctoral dissertation, was Ideologies of Intervention. And what interested me then, even then, was an attempt at escaping a kind of bewitchment, at becoming conscious of the ideological effects of a certain large-scale historical interpretation of global order, an interpretation that, true, might have done some things well, but must also be undone in a context very different from the one in which it gained currency. To be clear, the main text was finished in August 2023, but subsequent events, including following the abhorrent attacks of October 7th, the horrific and ongoing destruction of Gaza, have only confirmed the urgency of this task. Because we lived once in an era of interventionism, and in that era, we became accustomed to a very particular narrative of the constitution of international society. During the mid-20th century, we often said a strongly sovereigntist iteration of world politics attained predominance over the course of decolonization, the Cold War, and a third world protest against Western-dominated order. This was a time when intervention, for any reason, in whatever form, was absolutely proscribed within the norms and rules of states, when good fences made good neighbors. In just a few decades, however, and following the collapse of the Soviet Union, there emerged an internationally legitimate practice of intervening for higher purposes, of, we said, saving strangers in places far away. To talk thereafter about intervention was most usually to talk about appalling human rights abuses, the international use of force as a right or as a duty, and the limits of sovereign equality. That interventionist era has surely now vanished. Rather, and quite suddenly, it's the discourse of non-intervention that seems everywhere in international relations today. The dominant present discourse, as a series of ongoing crises suggests, is once again about defending state borders, about respecting or realizing national identity, about putting up walls. To quote, for instance, the foreign ministers of the original BRICS countries in their June 2021 statement on a multilateral reform, a more equitable and representative multipolar international system firmly committed to sovereign equality and non-interference in internal affairs, is taking root in the relative decline of the United States. At the same time, this isn't only a story of emerging or emerged powers. It's also a story of Trump, of Brexit, and of populist, often far-right nationalism as a trans-regional phenomenon. And it, of course, encompasses and has exposed in greater moral and political complexity changing perceptions of the injuries and ongoing destructiveness of interventions assumed of late, calamity in Afghanistan and the ruins of Libya, for example. How are we to make sense of these sweeping changes in global order? Following from the right of state sovereignty, the duty not to intervene is, after all, a cornerstone of modern IR and IR theory. So what might it mean to return to a world of non-intervention in multipolarity or the like? What's at stake, including as a matter of human values or rights or protection, when interventionism is left behind? The key question of the book is, what is the function of the concepts of intervention and non-intervention in global international society? Now, true, for a long time, the dominant way of approaching these issues has been through the lens of cosmopolitan or liberal solidarist duties, including the responsibility to protect. But even if we're to recognize, as we should, that this approach illuminated an important post-Westphalian debate over the conditionality of state sovereignty, we should also admit that sovereignty as responsibility, at least as we usually know it, is not enough. Yes, R2P is one part of the story, and yes, longer histories might be told of related liberal arguments, but such orthodoxies do not help us come to terms with the more diverse functions of intervention and non-intervention historically, and they have too little to offer, I'm suggesting, presently. Rather, what we need is a much more critical understanding that picks up where this dominant approach left off, that meets the much discussed death of R2P or the end of the era of humanitarian intervention in a way that exposes not just the imperial and colonial complicities of intervention through bygone eras. I think by now those are very well established, but the normative and practical contributions of non-intervention with respect to the pursuit of justice. A new research program for our turbulent present has to be rooted in an internationalist non-alignment and the contestations and practices of the global South beyond its caricature. And it's a story that should start when the formal membership of international society for the first time comes to encompass the entire globe, as I suggest, as many others suggest as well, in 1945. Now, you might be wondering why a journey back to the mid or late 20th century. Well, I suggest we ought to revisit this period, not just because it was one of heightened East-West geopolitical tensions, but because it was one of South-North encounters around grave injustice, inequality, and cultural difference that also have a clear bearing on the present. The period's so-called revolt against the West is not to be understood in a straightforwardly Bullian sense, that is, as a threat to the viability of order or of order as an essentially European or Western contrivance. Rather, we have to approach the third world challenge as bound up in processes of contestation and exchange that transformed a much more contingent society of states. And so the book fits into then and builds upon a series of recent writings, some of which appear on the screen. And my interest is tracing the revolt in terms of its reconstituting rather than its rejecting of global order, which is a historical process we too hastily think to know already. Now, classical scholars of the intervention problem, R.J. Vincent and Nicholas Wheeler, for example, have of course explored mid-20th century global order before. Yet existing writing has often neglected, if not outright forgotten, the debate that at the time was most prominently fostered by smaller states and the post-colonial world. The debate not just about whether intervention, but what is intervention? What does it mean, according to whom, and at what times? What does it mean to intervene, according to whom, and at what times? And historically, in fact, the answer to this question is not at all obvious. In 1968, for instance, when the Journal of International Affairs published its special issue on intervention, the word was, quote, extremely common in discussions of international politics, but its wide usage had not resulted in common understanding, making it as misunderstood now as balance of power or splendid isolation were decades ago. So intervention once invited a series of rich and unusual questions about military force and the promotion of human rights, of course, but also about dependence and peaceful coexistence, race and self-determination, domestic jurisdiction and competence in international law, and the structures and agents of the world economy, for example. A major task then of the book is to theorize fundamentally what Wheeler, Vincent, and others did not, that the definition of intervention is always a deeply political question tied to the legitimation of power and wholly unresolved in the practices of states then and now. Furthermore, I suggest that this critique of the inadvertent naturalism of the English school, or what Richard Little once called the traditionalist school, might also be made of much post-traditionalist literature of the past 20 years. To take just one example, we might point to a recent and very important special issue of the Review of International Studies, which, in not, quote, wanting to get bogged down in the difficulty of defining the term, stipulated the definition of intervention as coercive interference, or the international use of force. What interests me in this book, in contrast, is precisely reckoning with that difficulty of defining the term. And so the book begins with an instructive story, which I use as a kind of foil to explain certain basic insights about concept formation and anti-naturalist concept formation in particular. In 1967, James Rosenau appeared at a conference at Princeton. It was called Intervention and the Developing States, really interesting conference that summoned over 200 from across political science and law and economics and government. And it was a conference devoted to answering a very specific question. What do we mean by intervention in international relations? And Rosenau opened the deliberations with a call for a properly scientific definition of intervention that would, quote, plainly recognize an interventionary act when it occurred. So he, at that time, a prominent behavioralist, later, of course, an IR theorist who recanted much of the quest for what he called analytic meaning, was warning against what he called undisciplined thought. He sought a more narrow and precise technical meaning in 1967, better suited for neutral predictions of behavior. And he suggested that if we're ever to have a clear debate about intervention in international relations, words should, quote, have the same meanings and ideas, the same reference. Intervention was, he claimed, a particular sort of event in IR, something that happened not through speculation or belief, but through coercion. Intervention meant coercive interference, often understood as the threat or use of force. And yet, he was rejected by conferees. That rejection, as Rosenau himself admitted, was vigorous. In fact, he wrote 2 major articles on the intervention concept in reply to the rejection, confessing that, quote, the experience of the Princeton conference had become an inescapable part of his thinking. So why such a fierce rejection? Well, first, conference participants like Hans Singer or Michael Brecker, Richard Falk, and others knew that many of the interventionary acts with which developing countries were most concerned were not limited to acts of coercion. They extended into other forms of international pressure. But also, these other scholars surely knew, or at least were on the verge of knowing, that as an evaluative concept and as tied up with rules and norms, the definition of intervention presents a politico-normative dilemma. It ought to have been understood that intervention as coercive interference was hegemonic in the sense of serving certain great powers, and in the sense of being colonial complicit in excluding the values of the post-colonial world. And so far from what many would assume in the 80s and 90s, coercive interference was not the only definition of intervention, nor was it the only definition available in international law, a common misunderstanding. In fact, legal publicists, historical and contemporary, and especially from beyond Europe, rather recognized a spectrum of meanings. And it's therefore ironic that Rosenau's conception of intervention would soon become, and remains today, one of the most widely cited definitions of the intervention concept, one that's become taken for granted in many strands of IR theory. So in the chapter, I show how the Rosenau definition experienced a kind of second life despite its rejection in the writings of people like John Vincent and Hedley Bull. The book argues then that the contested nature of this concept is unavoidable in an explanation of its international function. Intervention is not just a coercive ordering practice. It's the thing itself to be reordered. And it's only within the scope of such contested meanings and their partial institutional embeddedness, rather than the strictures of cosmopolitan liberal political theory or any posited conception of legitimacy, that accounts of global order should be given. We must therefore be attentive in a way we have not been before to these self-interpretations of statespeople. And as I show, especially the self-interpretations of statespeople from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. My aim is to map out a series of international struggles over what statespeople do and might do with the concept of intervention. Assessing discursive change is no longer a developmentalist account of convergence upon a single higher understanding, but about contestation and evaluative redescription as part of an ongoing and intrinsically unequal process in which states compete to legitimize their international actions. And it therefore reflects the basic purpose and interpretive commitments of a genealogy. To make this argument, I uncover a series of different theories of what it means to intervene and their uptake and displacement in beliefs over time. I suggest that what is meant by intervention, and therefore what is meant by a duty not to intervene, must always be located in the context of its historical use. Now, I don't have time to trace all the theories or the sub-theories discussed in this book in this presentation today. But I could synthesize my account by saying that the non-interventionism of the 20th century is best understood in terms of a clash between two broad ways of thinking, or discursive practices, as I call them in the book. On the one hand, there emerged, particularly in the Cold War practice of Western great powers, a dictatorial theory of intervention as coercive or dictatorial interference. That will sound familiar. This is a theory that relates to the writings of jurists like Lawrence and Oppenheim, and it basically refers to the idea of intervention as the threat or use of force, and armed force especially. On the other hand, there emerged what I call an anti-colonial theory of intervention as the effect or outcome of foreign pressure, and specifically pressure at the expense of self-determined futures. This is a theory introduced in the second chapter of the book. It draws from Latin American legal tradition, for instance, the writings of the Argentinian diplomat and publicist Carlos Calvo. And yet, this second anti-colonial theory of intervention also went further, much further than Calvo. At the Bandung Conference of 1955, for example, the duty never to intervene came to be associated with new international humanitarian duties, particularly duties related to anti-colonialism and anti-racism. From this view, humanitarian solidarity was to be clearly distinguished from humanitarian intervention. Now, the idea of an internationalism that is not an interventionism might sound counterintuitive initially, but it was not counterintuitive in the beliefs of Asian and African statespeople at the time. How could this be? Well, part of the reason had to do with their conception of domestic jurisdiction, a conception that scholars and diplomats later forgot or misconstrued in favor of one based on geography rather than on law. But another part, even more important, had to do with this idea of self-determination, understood as a right as well as a primary human right, which all states had a duty to promote and respect. Developing in detail this Bandung theory and tracing its institutional trajectory in the UN is the focus of my third, fourth, and fifth chapters. But let me explain this Bandung theory here a little further. Not in detail, but basically. Because we often remember the non-interventionism of the Global South as absolute or unconditional. And that much, as a matter of self-description, is of course correct. Right? The 5 principles of peaceful coexistence enunciated by China and India in 1954, and their adoption, the 10 Bandung principles 1 year later, clearly did proscribe intervention in any form for whatever reason in the internal affairs of any state. Yet, Bandung also understood peace as interdependent with freedom. To quote, in fact, its final communique, peace is interdependent with freedom. As Quinn-Pham and Robbie Shilliam tell us, attendees at Bandung introduced anti-colonialism and anti-racism as constitutive principles of a new world order, rather than as background aspirations in a bipolar rivalry of great powers. So the positive face of an emerging, non-aligned and global Southern identity was in fact about legitimizing international protection from the human rights abuses of empire and extreme racism. These international actions might appear to contravene the duty never to intervene through any form of foreign pressure in the essentially domestic affairs of states. They do seem to involve foreign pressure in the essentially domestic affairs of state, but only at first brush do they involve that. Because in discursive practice prominent in the UN debate over the treatment of Indians in South Africa, for example, and notably also in major decisions of the International Court of Justice, the reach of domestic jurisdiction was always an essentially relative question. The prevention of apartheid and of genocide, for instance, came to be understood as an international responsibility, and it's matters of international law. So too did the promotion of self-determination, understood as a right and a primary human right. Voluntary acceptances of sovereign obligations under the Charter, under multilateral treaties, under international law more generally, were known at once as a manifestation of sovereignty and its limitation, but not its violation. To quote Fadil Jamali, the Iraqi delegate at Bandung, in his discussion there of the problem of colonialism and the dependent peoples of North Africa, well, we cannot interfere with the internal affairs of France, but we can invoke the right of self-determination of the people. We can invoke human rights, he said. So Afro-Asian solidarity, in my account, was about a solidarist internationalism that was also a non-interventionism. There was a crucial difference, which I trace in historical self-descriptions and ascendant discursive practice between an interventionist and an internationalist. And that crucial difference was in fact increasingly recognized in shared rules and norms, things like UN declarations. This deeply misunderstood theory of intervention underpinned what British IR theorist Martin White once called the Bandung UN. This was the UN that envisioned and hastened the liquidation of empire and the dismantlement of international racial hierarchy. It was the UN that aided and stood in solidarity with, to give just one example, the just struggle of the peoples of Southern Africa to self-determine, to achieve their sovereignty, and to end apartheid. Yet, if Martin White got that phrase, Bandung UN, very right, he also got something very wrong when he claimed that the, quote, limits of Article 2, paragraph 7, the article and paragraph that states the UN shall not intervene in the domestic affairs of its members, when he said that the limits of that article and paragraph were first explored in the case of South Africa, and that, quote, it was not contemplated at San Francisco that the UN should be an organization for collective intervention. He also misunderstood the Bandung theory of what it means to intervene. And it's on account of a similar contemporary misunderstanding that it's today so commonplace to detect in the internationalism of the Global South a contradiction with its non-interventionism. For an anti-colonial register, acts of intervention can never uphold human rights or humanitarian duties. Rather, acts of intervention in this register are always and essentially violations of human rights and shared humanitarian responsibilities, rights and responsibilities, including of self-determination. In this register, then, the liberal solidarist tension between human rights and sovereignty is dissolved. For here, internationalism moves through nationalism, and state values and human values are understood as mutually reinforcing. And so the main argument of the book is that this anti-colonial redescription of intervention, of what it means to intervene, was an astonishing feat in the society of states, and yet it's been deeply misunderstood. Major institutional developments of our times, the first UN Declaration on non-intervention in 1965, the Friendly Relations Declaration of 1970, the second UN Declaration on non-intervention in 1981, the humanitarian intervention proposals of the 90s, even the UN Charter itself, cannot be properly appreciated outside of the politics and vicissitudes of what came to be known as the Bandung spirit. And the story of progressive internationalist change in the UN becomes one about the falling out of a colonial complicit Oppenheim-Lawrence theory of intervention from the rules and norms of states, and the relative ascendance of the anti-colonial or Bandung theory until at least the late 70s or early 80s. Now, it's not, of course, that Bandung and its solidarist internationalism was a matter of pure and simple universal consensus. Even within the non-aligned movement, for example, there were fierce disagreements about its limits and its proper application. A clear bifurcation did emerge between moderate and radical wings of the Global South project. Moments like the Tricontinental Conference of 1966 exposed attempts at radically appropriating the Bandung spirit and its theory of legitimate internationalist action, including through forms of coercion. And we can see these tensions play out in processes like that of the Friendly Relations Declaration and the Friendly Relations process, where, for instance, tricontinentalist solidarity was specifically cited by statespeople and jurists representing a moderate majority as illegal, illegitimate, and subversive interventionism. So we can detect those bifurcations. And there are also, of course, quandaries to be noted about what is a people, and what Tony Angie calls third world sovereignty. That is, quandaries about how to make and maintain nation states in the aftermath of empire, about the possibilities and pitfalls of territorial integrity, or the doctrine of uti possidetis juris, and about the theme of internal colonialism and the post-colonial state. And true, there's also the matter of recognizing the controversies of solidarist internationalism in spheres wrongly omitted in today's intervention debate. So for instance, the second last chapter of the book focuses on the centrality of intervention language in the New World Information and Communication Order and the New International Economic Order. In this chapter, I'm capturing changing conditions of what it means to intervene in terms of structural and exploitative relationships within a world economy. I'm looking at things like debt traps, tide aid, foreign propaganda, what was called even then in the 1970s and early 80s, in fact, fake or false news. I'm looking at new roles for transnational corporations. All of this is understood in terms of intervention and non-intervention. At the same time, I'm reflecting these in this chapter and on these pages that on the alleged internationalism, but not interventionism of certain acts of nationalization of things like producers associations, including OPEC. There's a lot of talk of the duty to balance and correct international information flows. But again, all of this is not simply a story of ideal consensus. A still more emancipatory anti-colonial intervention in terms of the NIEO or the NWICO was not a matter of universal diffusion. But my point is that this recurring struggle in international society of the anti-colonial or Bandung theory on the one hand, and the Oppenheim-Lawrence or dictatorial theory of intervention on the other, best explains how the function of intervention was changing. To pull this together, it was during and through Cold War decolonization that states overcame a once hegemonic theory of the non-intervention principle, one that weakened the hand of the UN, one that had been intended to preserve sovereign licenses of colonial and racial exploitation, and one that had been established in a moment of great power unity that accompanied the end of the Second World War. Likewise, I suggest that the post-Cold War interventionist era was not some clean break with the past, some development that can be understood outside of the context of South-North contestation and decolonization. By recovering a more critical and global account of societal change, the book is unmasking the post-Cold War moment as itself one of contestation and redescription. Interventionism was in fact a radical and skillful inversion of our values. Radical in the sense of effacing previous understandings of sovereign equality, which rejected any notion of an international hierarchy of nations or of peoples, races, or of civilizations. And it was skillful in a rhetorical and ideological sense, for interventionism was, I submit, premised on a dangerously teleological and untruthful view of international society. One that claimed an era of absolute non-intervention was one in which sovereignty became a shield behind which states or quasi-states, mainly in the developing world, and guilty of the most heinous of crimes, could legitimately hide their international responsibilities. The Bandung theory tells a very different story. This was a redescription and an ideological move, if you'd like, that claimed the society of states was divided for over 40 years between competing blocs, and it was therefore unable to act and powerless in its pursuit of justice. It was frozen by Cold War dynamics and the sovereigntism of the global South. Now, scholars like Rajan Menon are right to say that liberal interventionism proved highly conceited. But what I claim is that the conceit of our late liberal interventionism was not merely a matter of hubris. The true conceit of the liberal interventionist moment was its misrepresentation of the Bandung UN and the meaning of non-intervention in global order. Liberal interventionism must be understood instead in terms of a large-scale retreat from the Bandung theory, including alternative models of international humanitarian protection, models that were rooted in respect for sovereign equality. In terms of, then, yes, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence or the Pan-Shield and its unconditional non-interventionism, but also in terms of the dynamic nature of domestic jurisdiction and of domestic jurisdiction based on the progressive development of law and society, not simply on geography, in terms of the duty not to intervene as consistent with the duty to internationally prevent mass atrocities like apartheid or genocide, and to internationally promote human rights, including the primary right of peoples to self-determination. In terms of competing internationalist aspirations of, for example, the 1965 Declaration of Non-Intervention, very much misunderstood. And in terms of emancipatory visions of non-intervention in international economic and international communicative spheres. And today that, of course, includes digital spheres. I'm saying that as multiple strains of the Bandung theory slipped from view, and as they came to be replaced, the meaning of the international implementation of shared responsibility blurred mendaciously into the historically separate activity of suspending state sovereignty. It was a resurrection, in fact, of the logic of trusteeship against which Southern revolt was originally waged. And so my hope is that a recovery of Southern and non-aligned theories of intervention might enliven us to the possibilities of the concept today. Genealogical analysis might serve as a repertoire for global reordering and for thinking about what it means to intervene. Understanding these changing conditions of what it's meant to intervene in different places and at different times might hence offer some thin ray of hope in these very dark times for the society of states and in relation to things like humanitarian protection and beyond. In contrast to those who see intervention either as a benevolent guardianship or a crusading imperialist ideology, I'm saying that we could continue to develop a picture of the progressive evolution of this vocabulary that's inclusive of multiple paths to solidarity. Now, the total number of theories covered in the book does go beyond the number I've highlighted today. My explanation of the R2P debate in the final chapter, for example, introduces a theory of intervention as international involvement. It's a very ordinary meaning of the term. And this helps us to see how all states did come to accept, as they arguably had before, that sovereignty implies responsibility, but also that sovereignty as responsibility need not imply an ever-increasing convergence on the notion of sovereignty's gradation or its suspension. But taken together, what all these theories are doing, all these lines of dissent, including the ones I didn't have time to discuss with you, what they're providing is a basis for a comprehensive revision of the global intervention debate. Not all of their logics, of course, are worth salvaging. Some are worth remembering precisely because of how very wrong they were. But charting the conflicts involved in their use requires unlearning much of what we thought to be true. For the dilemma of our present can no longer be taken for granted as a kind of stark conflict between a crudely sovereigntist order and a cosmopolitan justice, nor should we assume it involves a choice, a simple choice between state sovereignty or human rights, the nation or global governance. To trace the trajectories of the Bandung theory is to undo these old infatuations. Ultimately, the viability of global order and the pursuit of global justice cannot be secured except by redefining once again what it means to intervene. So that's what intervention before interventionism is basically arguing. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for this really fascinating lecture. And I'm sure many of us will go and grab the book and read it after this. Yeah, we have opened for questions, and anyone who wants to ask a question or make a comment, just use these emotions and raise your hand, or just come in. There are not many of us, so we can easily manage. And while maybe others gather their thoughts, I want to just make an observation and a question. The observation is that actually this problem, or this contestation over the definition of intervention, which you began with, in some ways is very similar, or reflects the similar problems with the concept of imperialism in Marxist tradition, because these days, as you know, leftists tend to see any form of exercise of influence or pressure as a form of imperialism. But what does it mean to think of imperialism in those terms, in a world which is interconnected, interdependent, and intrinsically uneven, and therefore resources and powers are different? So actually any form of interaction could include or involve some sort of influence just by virtue of the uneven nature of those interacting states or societies. So we have a working group separate from the center, and we have been looking at this problem and whether imperialism should be limited to actually territorial annexation, which used to be the classical form, or what does it mean to say, I don't know, US is imperialist today, as opposed to the older forms of empire. But the question is actually about the subject, or rather the object of intervention. And I wonder if in your research on Bandung theory, you found any sustained reflection on the way in which post-colonial states collapsed the state and the people as the subject of self-determination into one another. In other words, in order to actually pursue those claims you described in that conference, in a way, the Bandung coalition of states implicitly adhere to a liberal concept of state and the people. And I'm saying that because in many post-colonial states, of course, you have all varieties of national minorities, whose condition increasingly by many people, at least in the part of the world I come from, is described as internal colonialism or other forms of colonialism and so on. So when they discuss this other principles, they seem to have this concept constant in the discussion. And I wonder, A, whether they were reflective on this, and B, what you think about this multiplicity of the peoples, the kind of problems conceptually that it poses to the theory of intervention in whichever form we might accept.
Well, yes, I mean, that observation sounds very apt. In fact, at the book launch last week here in Singapore, I'm reminded of what Robbie Shilliam said about that special issue of the Review of International Studies in 2013, which did adopt this definition of intervention as coercive interference. Robbie, who participated in that issue, said, he asked early on, why are we talking about intervention when what we should really be debating is the meaning of imperialism? And that, in the end, wasn't apparently the decision of the workshop to study. But I think it relates really nicely to what you're saying. So I think in the Society of States among diplomats, this observation was made. In fact, it was even made at Bandung. There was much discussion about the difference and similarities between intervention and imperialism at Bandung in 1955. At one point, Nehru, and I have this quoted in the book, points out that, well, things like foreign propaganda count as foreign pressure. They're not imperialism, but they are intervention. And so state people in short were well aware of the possibility of comparing these things and also distinguishing one from another. I guess part of the problem, of course, was hammering out a kind of both a final communique and a political program that united. Bandung was a very diverse place, and it wouldn't be on account of a Marxist definition of imperialism that the program would emerge. In fact, so much of moderate, non-aligned organizing was around very different sorts of understandings of imperialism. I did mention that at the Tricontinental, there was an attempt to, appropriate for radical purposes the Bandung theory. I mean, it wasn't only, of course, the Tricontinental. That's a very good symbol to point to. There's for every meeting of not every, but a good number of meetings of the non-aligned movement, there were also meetings of the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization with a different sort of agenda, a different sort of understanding of imperialism. I guess what's important to note is that solidarist internationalism, which I think best expresses the Global South project and its kind of intergovernmental geometries, the non-aligned movement, the G77, if you'd like, was a project of solidarist internationalism rather than a project of, say, proletarian internationalism. And proletarian internationalism might have been the basis upon which to organize certain relations, certain regions, but it was certainly not the basis of organizing the problem of intervention or imperialism at the global Society of States level. Usually the debate was in terms of peaceful coexistence, a word that was seen at the time as laden with kind of Marxist theoretical meaning. Of course, one way of reading the phrase peaceful coexistence is the coexistence of states. But there were multiple competing definitions about its relationship with class. And so, in fact, the resolution adopted at the Tricontinental that best expresses the distinction between solidarist internationalism and proletarian internationalism is the resolution on peaceful coexistence of 1966. So I guess in short, what I'm saying is that all sounds right. Of course, so I think the concept of imperialism should, in our discussions, our theorizing, be compared to and distinguished from imperialism at different points in time. I think that can elucidate the function of the concept. But as a matter of the Global South project, it's important not to conflate these things. Actually, in order to understand it, we need to see how very different they were. But I acknowledge the observation and think it's very helpful. I do say too. If I might just add, I do say as well in the introduction of the book, right, that the import of Marxist theorizing on international society is usually underplayed. I mean, it's something that needs to be explored at a greater length. But the purpose of the book is to expose instead this kind of layer of or space of shared understanding that isn't limited to those forms of theorizing. I mean, it's in terms of its non-alignment, it was between the superpowers, but also between, if you'd like to call them, superpower ideologies. And so for that reason, the theorizing that was most impactful on U.S. operations and so on
yeah, I mean,
solidarist internationalism. I mean, you might argue that these things can coexist. I mean, Soviet theories of international law and so on. That I do have a bit of that in the book, which you can see in the introduction and part of the first chapter.
Yeah. No, I mean, I didn't mean at all that the book should have engaged with it. I was just that I encountered the same issues with respect to that concept and its overextension or overlimitation, which, somehow the concept is criticized from so many different quarters, and yet it's still in use. So there is something about it which persists, and I think the same goes for the intervention. But I didn't mean that it should be part of the book. Anyways, so I would open the floor to others if they want to come in. Anyone wants to ask a question or make a comment?
I have sort of one small question, one question that's not quite formulated, so it might not come out correctly. Thanks for a great talk, by the way, Patrick. It's really interesting. This sort of area is not specifically within my field, so sorry if this question's quite sort of trivial, but towards the end of the book, you mentioned there was a sort of post-Cold War interventionist era. So I was wondering, how would you currently describe the current era of intervention? Are we still within this sort of liberal period of intervention? And secondly, I was wondering if you could say a bit more on how, I think you made the argument that reapplying some of these anti-colonial theories of intervention is the sort of strategy or the pathway which we should adopt moving forward. And I was wondering how reapplying some of these anti-colonial theories will help to, obviously I know you spoke about the Badung theory, but I was wondering if you could say a bit more about how these would sort of tackle this liberal theory of intervention, specifically because, and this is the bit that I haven't really sort of formed at the moment, I was wondering if the book sort of talks about the role of power within the theory of intervention, and how if an issue with this sort of liberal conception of intervention is because of the sort of the abuse of power within that relationship, how would that then be prevented within a sort of anti-colonial conception, if that makes sense?
Thank you for the kind words, and thanks, Sam. And great question as well. So yes, the status of liberal interventionism today. So, I mean, I do think that we've exited from the era of liberal interventionism. A lot of people talk about the death of R2P. Even people like Michael Ignatieff mentioned the end of the era of humanitarian intervention. I'm someone who is, of course, very much involved in the entrance into that era. So I think we've exited it. I think it's at the same time important to understand how institutionalized vocabularies like R2P aren't equal to liberal intervention. So if you're asking where are we now, we've exited the era of liberal interventionism. We've inherited some of the concepts that accompanied the kind of emergence of liberal interventionism, R2P being the best example. But those concepts, and for instance, the idea of sovereignty as responsibility, are not equal to liberal interventionist accounts of sovereignty as responsibility. So in the final chapter of the book, I kind of clarify what I'm saying now by talking about northern and southern interpretations of the R2P concept. A lot of people in 2011, which was the year in which NATO embarked upon its intervention in Libya, were talking about how that was a moment of R2P's full-blown test case. It was an era of a moment of the test case of R2P. And they talked about how it was a time of its NATOization. David Reef mentioned in the New York Times that that R2P and intervention was being NATOized in Libya. In the period since, you've seen things like the emergence of Brazil's concept paper on responsibility while protecting, and an emphasis on kind of the enduring relevance of international humanitarian responsibility, but without the suspension of sovereignty. So I argue in that last chapter that it seems like a version of R2P has survived, and we can talk about whether that's for better or for worse, and we can talk about the holes in maybe something like a Southern interpretation. But if the Northern interpretation, let's say the NATO version of R2P is subsiding, there has been a kind of relative uptake of something like a Southern interpretation of R2P, a version of R2P that insists upon adherence to sovereign equality and other bonding principles, if you'd like, including presumably self-determination. So I think that's at least in the dimension of international humanitarian protection where we are today. But as I try to suggest in the book, intervention is a concept that means so much more than just this, although this is obviously a very important part of it and one we never want to leave behind. The other dimension that's very important today is the digital frontier, digital intervention, digital sovereignty. That is in the UN how the debate has emerged and kind of shifted gears. I do think that there's a lot to learn from the 60s and 70s on the new World Information Communication Order in relation to this debate on digital sovereignty and digital intervention. So in a way, there's continuity, but also there's something kind of at least a new technologies at play, and that's where we're standing today. If that kind of clarifies, that's where I perceive us as standing today.
Excellent. Anyone else?
I'll give it a go if you like.
Sure, yeah, come in, please.
Not my field, but so interesting and so much information. Thank you. And like I say, I've been out of university for a few months now, so I'm not up to speed with these things. But just for example, I mean, the sovereignty question always comes up for me, especially these days with climate change, and as the world needs to come together, it seems to be atomizing, and you mentioned just in passing there, you mentioned Brazil, and again, this may be a very ignorant question to you guys, but or to you, Patrick, but talking about, I can't quite remember what you said, it was very quick, but sort of Brazil's sense of responsibility and so on. They wrote a concept paper or something like that. But it always strikes me this sovereignty thing is mixed up in it because they treat many of their own people, including their indigenous people, so badly. It's sort of it's posturing on the international stage as a power, but then in your own compartmentalized territory, abusing people who you might want to protect in the other place. Do you see what I mean? That's probably a very simplistic idea to you, but could you just unpick that a bit?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So what I'm getting from what you've said has something to do with the kind of the posturing that's involved in when we use the language of intervention, the hypocrisy, the double standards, the internal contradictions when we make claims about justice on this question and so on. That is very much inherent in the ways that the languages of intervention and non-intervention have always been used. Arguably, it's inherent with the ways we use any of these political concepts. I think that when the responsibility, while protecting proposal was introduced in the UN in the aftermath Brazil in 2011, and the gradual reform of it's a longstanding BRICS commitment, for example, of UN institutions and the kind of perfecting of the R2P formula, and it also had in mind its own foreign policy priorities. But this is kind of only it's grist to the mill of a story of a genealogy of intervention. This is precisely the sorts of considerations we want to have in mind, because states are always using this language to legitimize their own actions or delegitimize the actions of others. That is the kind of context that we want to pick out. But I think you're right. Of course, you're right to recognize that there are each of these eras. It's never as if the ideals are perfectly implemented. But that is kind of the dynamics of these languages of intervention and the dynamics of other political concepts too.
And I love the use of the genealogy. That's the sort of contextualization of these things is brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you.
Excellent. Anyone else wants to chip in? No?
Can I have another go?
Yeah, go ahead.
In my own sort of area that I'm increasingly getting into is conservation. Maybe this is too at a tangent, but just thinking of colonialism and intervention in the conservation sphere. Your focus is more. Well, you tell me. Is it? I haven't read it, I'm afraid, yet. But humanitarian and conflict and that kind of thing, rather than conservation.
Yes, although I think that I think that all this talk of the dynamic nature of domestic jurisdiction relates to other sorts of international responsibilities, including kind of ecological ones or conservation responsibilities. So I think when we talk about responsible sovereignty, we're also thinking about those sorts of international commitments in a way. I don't write about it in the book, but arguably that does kind of represent one of the newer frontiers, along with the digital one that I mentioned before. Those are the sorts of international responsibilities that must be understood as consistent with a resurgent sovereigntism, or resurgent non-interventionism.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew. Anyone else? Right.
One thing
One thing
I sadly didn't have the time to discuss at length in the presentation, but might be of interest. In part, has to do with when I at the book launch last week, Robbie pointed out that I hadn't said much about famous genealogists like Nietzsche or Foucault in my presentation. And it's as if Foucault was kind of absent from my thinking. There is a really interesting argument that was first noticed by a scholar, Jessica White, about the place of Foucault in the humanitarian intervention debate, which when I first found it, I thought was really quite enlightening, which shows that how intellectuals like Foucault at a neoliberal moment thought about human rights in terms of confronting governments. But what really happened was that this hope to use human rights by a community of the governed, to quote Foucault, individuals against governments, was really just picked up by other governments to confront other governments and to reintroduce the gradation of sovereignty, the standard of civilization, the trusteeship, against which Southern revolt was originally waged, like I said in the presentation. So I would just add, since it's a presentation on genealogy, there's actually a bit of Foucault, there's some Nietzsche as well in my discussion of world making and Amia Srinivasan's work on world making and genealogy. There's a reference to Nietzsche's comment on revolt as an attempt at redistributing the morality of a society and how that's involved in these sorts of moves of legitimation that are also moves about power and power redistribution. So it is there. It's kind of submerged. You're seeing if this does happen to interest any of you, you're seeing the kind of the tip of the iceberg on that question. But I do love to talk about it, and it did. There was a good amount of time during my the doctoral revisions that I looked quite closely at the famous genealogists. It's just that I guess I encountered the anti-naturalism of Mark Beaver, which really helped me to realize that in order to make this argument about intervention before interventionism, it wasn't necessary to go through each of those steps of Foucault and Nietzsche, as laudable and as important as they are for that for this kind of area of thought. I would just add.
Thank you so much, Patrick. I guess given the time difference, it might be a good point to end. It must be very late in Singapore, right?
No, it's not to worry. I'm a bit of a night owl, but I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for listening.
No, it was a great pleasure, and
I appreciate the questions, and Kevin.
Absolutely, no, it was great to have you, and we wish you all the best for the future work, and maybe see you sometimes at Sussex at some point. Yeah.
Sounds wonderful.
All right.
Thank you very much again for hosting.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Cameron. Thanks, Cameron.
Bye.
Bye-bye.